You're listening to WRPI Troy. By the way, this music you've been listening to is called Sitar for Yoga by Alan Desomer, Desomer, and Sitar for Yoga. That's the name of the CD. I want to thank you all for being with us today on In the Spirit. I'm your host, Gary Goldberg, and I want to introduce to you my next guest, and his name is Tony Wright. And him and his partner, Graham Ginn, wrote this incredible book, Return to the Brain of Eden, Restoring the Connection Between Neurochemistry and Consciousness. And let me tell you a little bit about it. Over a period of 1 million years, the human brain expanded at an increasingly rapid rate. And then 200,000 years ago, the expansion abruptly stopped. Modern science has overlooked this in order to maintain that we are at the pinnacle of our evolution. However, the halt of brain expansion explains not only recently uncovered anomalies within the human brain, but also the global traditions of an earthly paradise lost and of humanity's degeneration from the original state of perpetual wonder and joy. Drawing on more than 20 years of research, authors Tony Wright and Graham Ginn explore how our modern brains are performing far below their potential and how we can unlock our higher abilities and return to the euphoria of Eden. They explain how for millions of years, early forest-dwelling humans were primarily consuming the hormone-rich sex organs of plants, fruit, each containing a highly complex biochemical cocktail evolved to influence DNA transcription, rapid brain development, and elevated neural and pineal gland activity. Citing recent neurological and psychological studies, the authors explain how the loss of our symbiotic fruit-based diet led to a progressive neurodegenerative condition characterized by aggressive behaviors, a fearful perception of the world, and the suppression of higher artistic, mathematical, and spiritual abilities. The authors show how many shamanic and spiritual traditions were developed to counteract our decline. They outline a strategy of raw foods, tantric sexuality, shamanic practices, and ethogen use to reverse our degeneration, restore our connection with the plant world, and regain the bliss and peace of the brain of Eden. And I'm happy to introduce to you on this hour of In the Spirit, author Tony Wright. Hello,
Hi, Gary.
Hi.
That sounds pretty grandiose, all of that.
Well, I think that it explains what your book's about and what you set out to do, and it makes sense to me, honestly. It's odd because a lot of people have this evolutionary perspective that the prefrontal cortex is expanding and we're getting smarter. But why, if that is the case, why are the world over in such a state of fear? We know what's going on in the world. I don't need to give a list. All people have to do is read the newspapers and look around them. How can we think this is a progressive state we're in, right?
Well, exactly. I mean, I don't think I've come up with anything new. I think I've just attempted to translate very ancient ideas into kind of modern language that our rational mind can understand. And yeah, that's kind of, certainly in Western culture at least, we've kind of grown up with this idea of how clever we are and how amazing it all is. But as soon as you ask a different question, as soon as you're willing to dare ask, well, actually, are we going down the pan here, and is it our state of mind? A lot of things just fall into place. It's really just a perspective that we've not really sort of grown up with, and I get that reaction a lot. It's kind of, oh my God, it's common sense. It's not really such a radical new idea. It's just we've never really thought about it like that.
Yeah, I think it is good to think about it. In fact, I've had some other authors on, and we talked about that, really went into depth about our connection with the plant kingdom, and how even before human beings ever were ever on this planet, there was a deep intelligence of the plant world, and which was here before us, and an intelligence was here before us. So to say that we didn't, it created us, we didn't create it.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's very easy to sort of get sucked into this kind of anthropomorphic view, and don't get me wrong. I think what we call ourselves humans, or however we name ourselves, I think something special was going on there, but not in an arrogant way. I think it was like the culmination of phenomenal complexity, and yes, depending on your perspective, it's almost like a sort of beingness arranging itself into an ever more complex form. And really, I think we all our particular traits, such as we still access, are traits of high intelligence and empathy and that sort of divine insight that we can glimpse from time to time. Really, that came out of the tropical forest. It's more like forest consciousness than human consciousness. And once we separated from the forest, we've sort of become trapped in a more typical mammalian state of mind, where we're kind of regressing to a more typical mammalian state of mind, which is great for survival. It's great for competition, but not too bright, and it doesn't have all these wonderful traits that we so allude to and kind of think we still have, but generally those traits are becoming increasingly rare.
You talk about left brain, right brain in your book, and tell us a bit. Why don't you lay out a little bit of the groundwork? What does the left brain do? What the left part of the brain do? What is it? What functions is it in charge of? And the right, and then we'll kind of lay out the groundwork for future conversation based on that.
Sure, yeah. Well, it's one area I revisited. Obviously, left-right brain research is hardly anything new, and there's been a lot of, general publications on it, and then a lot of in-depth research, certainly in Western tradition going back about 50 years, and then probably alluded to in other traditions, even if they didn't call it that. And what I did was I got interested in kind of looking at some of the data. I think the data is very good, the sort of stuff that Michael Gazzaniga and people like him have been working on for years and years. And it struck me quite early on that maybe there's something really obvious being missed here, because they were all talking about these apparently specialized abilities between the hemispheres, the left hemisphere being generally regarded as perceptually dominant. It gives us our major sense of who we are. It's our sort of everyday sense of self. And it has these so-called advanced traits like conceptual thinking, abstract thought. Speech, of course, is again often regarded as a very unique human sort of, or culminating trait almost. It's often perceived as very advanced. And the right hemisphere, a bit more mysterious. We kind of draw on it, but it's not perceptually dominant. It sort of deals with things like emotions, although it certainly seems to be linked with phenomenal memory, and savant syndrome and prodigious genius traits seem to be linked to the right hemisphere as well. So kind of a strange dichotomy going on there, but generally perceived to be, or generally regarded as specialized abilities. The left is dominant. It's got the cool advanced stuff, as I say, these abstract thinking thought processes and so on. And then in more recent times, I think there's been a bit of a dilution of that. I think since neural imaging came along, there's a lot of people said, oh, it's not quite as simple as that, and, you know, we use both hemispheres and so on and so forth. But if you look at the data again, and I always invite people to go and have a look at the data, and two things struck me quite early on, that the general view, again, the left hemisphere being perceptually dominant, so it's kind of effectively looking at itself. It's designing the experiments, looking at the data. So you have that, and then amongst all these, let's say, specialized abilities, some quite bizarre things crop up, particularly when you think about them in the context of the ancient traditions. So, for example, the left hemisphere is generally regarded as being susceptible to or perpetually deluded. It's quite odd, but it's in the literature. And you know how delusion crops up in virtually every tradition, or the spiritual traditions anyway, that humanity's been sliding into a form of delusion for a long time. And there it is in the modern literature, the left hemisphere susceptible to delusion. It also, another trait that's ascribed to the left hemisphere is that it perpetually lies to itself. The term is confabulation, so it lies to itself and it doesn't even know it's doing it. It's regarded as not being able to perceive reality directly. It has to invent, well, concepts and abstract thoughts and so on, which are regarded as advanced, but actually they're approximations of reality, or at least they're inventions. So you start putting all these things together, and it struck me, it's like, well, hang on a minute, if this is a piece of equipment we're using to look, you know, it's looking at itself in the mirror, it's dominant, and it has all these traits, surely we should be incredibly cautious about trusting any of its conclusions. So I kind of turned it back to front, and I was thinking, well, you know, maybe the left hemisphere isn't actually the advanced hemisphere. Sure, it's in charge. Maybe it's actually a degenerate form of the right hemisphere. And of course, you know, then I wanted to sort of explore how that could have come about, and that's where we get into the evolutionary context. But yeah, that's really a sort of summary. We have this sort of standard thinking that specialist adaptations, each hemisphere has its own sort of sphere of influence, and they evolve like that, and it's exactly how it's supposed to be. But I think where modern science is made one big mistake is the assumption that our neural system works, you know, almost as if it fell out of the sky, how does it work? And in science, as far as I can tell, you never assume or never presume anything works, and that question's never been really, you know, addressed by any of the modern researchers as far as I can tell. How do we know the damn thing works? And if you step back and look at the data with fresh eyes, it's apparent to me that our dominant hemisphere displays a huge array of pathological traits, and they're embedded in all the literature. It's not a new discovery. It's kind of screaming at us. And then what do? We ignore the obvious and translate it or confabulate it into a story of advanced specialized abilities, exactly what the data says we would do. So, you know, left-right brain stuff I think is central to this, and of course a lot of people are familiar with it, but I'd suggest to anybody listening, look at it again and ask a different question.
Yeah, thank you. Return to the Brain of Eden. It's quite a book. Did it take you a while to put together?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. I guess my interest started roughly 20 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. I mean, I didn't set off on a grand mission or anything. I was more a sort of series of accidents. I actually grew up with, you know, a sort of working class background and a pretty straight, pretty limited perspective on things. And if it couldn't be proved, it didn't exist. Sort of fairly sort of limited rational mentality. But I eventually ended up doing some sort of studies of plant biochemistry, this kind of stuff, and bumped into some people who had other perspectives, people with interests in things like Buddhism, shamanism, this kind of stuff, which challenged my world, my very limited worldview. And through, as I say, through a series of almost accidents, I just became interested in putting the sort of plant science background to work and began questioning a lot of assumptions and actually began experimenting with approaches that are obviously still alive today in some parts of the world and seem to be alluded to in a lot of these traditions, together with a sort of, I guess, a health-driven interest in diet. I changed my diet to what people would call a raw diet, but actually is the natural diet. What humans normally eat is absolutely unique. We're the only species that denatures our food with heat. We change the molecular structure before we build ourselves with it. So I got interested in that just for health reasons. I didn't have a great big plan, but that in turn began to sort of oil the wheels, and I ended up doing experiments with sleep deprivation and entheogens, this kind of stuff, and took me to some fascinating places. Obviously not unique, the kind of places a lot of people try to talk about, but I became, I guess, almost obsessed to try and figure out, well, what's going on here? Why are these states of mind accessible if you put these techniques in place? Why can't we access them every day? They seem phenomenally better than our everyday states. And I guess that was the origins of my interest. And it was a case of experimentation, combing through the literature for anything that might offer up any clues, and taking cues really from these universal traditions that, as I say, generally to me, they seem to talk about humanity being in a very, very different state in Arcadian times and sort of progressively sliding into a degenerate form, a more aggressive form, and losing this perceptual awareness that was once universal. So again, this kind of diagnosis handed down to us, saying something was going wrong and almost warning us of what was going wrong, together with a lot of, today we call them practices, but I like to try and reframe that. I've tried to put all this in language that my rational mind can understand. So really talking about treatments, what were they doing? Why were they doing these things? Why do we need to meditate to access these states? Why does it not just work? Why do we need to do yoga? Why do we need to take entheogens and so on? So I kind of viewed them as potential treatments and using the treatments themselves as a diagnostic tool. What were they trying to treat? What's the underlying cause here? So that's kind of some of the background, and it kind of all came together, interestingly enough, in altered states. It was kind of classic eureka moments where it just suddenly all made sense. It was like, oh my God, we've got this back to front. We're looking at it, trying to figure out what's going on through the wrong piece of equipment. It's a piece of equipment that can't possibly see what's going on because it's actually broken. But that's the piece of equipment we think is normal.
And even healthy and normal, right?
Well, exactly. It's again, I think it's embedded in these traditions. There's this endless sort of effort to try and get out of the egotistical, speech-dominant, rational thinking mind, as if that really is the problem. Well, I think they were bang on right. We just, because we're so deeply embedded in it now, and because it has these traits that the relatively objective research is telling us, basically that it's deluded, it lies, it's terrified of anything unfamiliar, it'll hang on to what it knows regardless of the evidence and so on. The data's all there, it's telling us what to expect, but we're so embedded in it, it's like we've all got a form of dementia, and if you have dementia and somebody says, hey, by the way, unfortunately you got dementia, it doesn't mean anything to you. You just carry on in the same direction. The facts alone don't make a lot of sense. So I think that's really the position we find ourselves in, exactly as these ancient traditions were warning us of, and we don't act accordingly. We can see, I think really what I'm talking about is severe mental ill health here, and I can't possibly get away with that if there's not evidence from all sort of quarters, whether it's mechanisms, an evolutionary context, and of course our behavior would exhibit traits of mental ill health. Well, as you said in the introduction, look out the window, read a newspaper, look at TV. We're so accustomed to the depths of degeneration that we don't even act appropriately anymore. It's kind of, oh yeah, this is bad, there's another war, or there's a bunch of greedy idiots taking everything or trashing the planet, let alone our day-to-day behavior, how we relate to each other, the conditioned rules we follow and so on. It's layer upon layer of kind of rigid behavior that we kind of accept as normal.
Yes. So what if along with let me ask you, what were the foods that comprise ancestral diets? You mentioned you changed your diet, raw foods, right?
Well, that was my initial sort of venture into changing some of the, some of the basic parameters. I've tried to put this again, as I say, in quite simplified and dumbed down language, and this is for my own mind. I had to make sense of what I was experiencing. So
yes.
And then being a typical male, engineering analogies work quite well for me. So basic engineering, what are the construction specifications? What are the fuel specifications? Really basic stuff. And any engineer will tell you if you change those parameters, particularly the design, and when I say design, I don't necessarily mean any kind of cosmic design. I mean transcription, how do you read the DNA, this kind of stuff. If you change those specifications on any kind of fairly high-tech project, you're going to get a different result. Yep.
So,
well, with the human brain, as far as we know, it's pretty much the most complex thing we know. It's incredibly sensitive to changes, particularly chemical changes. And the evolutionary data we have tells us that construction materials, the neurochemical fuel is changed out of all recognition. It's not even biological anymore for the most part. We take it out of the biological realm because we heat it. But getting further back again, and to try and address your question, the thing that struck me that was particularly unique in our origins, if the modern anthropologists and primatologists have it right, and of course it's echoed in these ancient traditions, was, again, what you alluded to, the sex organs of a wholly other kingdom, the sex organs of the angiosperms. Of course, today we know it as fruit, and we think it's something healthy to eat. Maybe a few people eat a bit more of it. Most people occasionally have a snack, and that's about it. Well, it's along the lines of a swollen ovary. So if you start ingesting the swollen sex organs, the swollen ovaries of a whole other kingdom, it's full of all sorts of complex biochemistry, including hormonally active compounds. And of course, hormones are absolutely integral to how DNA is read. It's like the reading mechanism. So if any organism that forms a relationship with the sex organs of another species, pretty weird, but that's what we did, it's going to have a massive impact on how DNA is read, and that, of course, changes structure and that changes function. So that's what jumped out at me. It was like, oh my God, that, of course, I was familiar with the idea of human ancestors, primate ancestors living in the forest eating fruit, and it's even in the literature, this idea of a form of symbiosis to do with seed dissemination. Here's the fruit, take it away, disseminate the seeds. But what I think was missed in that wasn't just the seed dissemination thing, but it's the fact that if you're ingesting these hormonally rich sex organs 24/7 over millions of years, it's going to have a massive impact on your physiology. You become a sort of symbiotic organism. So that was really another area that jumped out as, okay, this is unique, this is fascinating. What impact must that have had? So it was really trying to chase down all the sort of mechanisms that could have had an impact, and how that might have changed the way our brain developed, and maybe it related to the fact that we had this huge neocortex, as a lot of the primates do. And obviously, if our neocortex was dependent on the forest, on the fruits of the forest, and we lost that connection for whatever reason, the impact would be equally, huge, of course, in the opposite direction. So this is what I was looking at, really just looking for clues, and could they be put together in a different way? Really nothing new in the pieces of data I was looking at. I was just rearranging them in a different way to see if I could come up with a coherent map that would explain these pieces of the jigsaw, the Arcadian mythology, the sort of religious spiritual traditions, modern Western science approach to evolutionary biology, left-right brain, all these things. Would it make sense of it? And obviously the result of that is the book, is sort of an outline of the theory. It does make sense. Symbiotic origins, responsible for the emergence of this phenomenal perceptual equipment, separation, and the equipment starts to fail because it cannot possibly operate without this biochemistry.
There used to be a saying going around, you are what you eat. And it seems to make sense.
Well, sure. I mean, in absolutely simplistic terms, of course it does. That is how we build, design, and fuel ourselves. Of course, as I say, the unique factor is here. Most species eat all sorts of stuff, and it doesn't have a massive impact on their own transcription environment. But when you start eating the transcription chemistry from another species, and you're eating it perpetually, it becomes this unique relationship. And so it's what we eat, and also in this case, in the case of specialized fruit eaters, it changes the way you're designed. It changes your developmental environment. It changes everything. And then you get these traits. Humans have particularly long juvenile phase, absolutely essential to grow a big brain. Well, lo and behold, fruit is rich in chemicals and hormones, or hormonally active compounds, that dampen down our very own hormones, things like testosterone and estrogen, which are the sort of basic mix for your average mammal, and other species, and other groups as well. But certainly with mammals, it's the sort of cocktail that reads the DNA and builds the basic mechanism. Well, the compounds in fruit modulate that very powerfully. So again, it changes the basic mechanisms, and the direction it would seem to go in is extending periods of juvenility. I mean, fruit really is designed to create a juvenile environment. It's fruit's the equivalent of the human uterus. It's growing its own next generation, highly compressed plants. We call them seeds. So again, ingesting that biochemical environment, we create a juvenile environment, and lo and behold, humans and some of the other primates do exhibit juvenile traits. We have this long juvenile phase. We have sort of features that people regard as hanging on to juvenile features. We have a flat face, and we have this colossal big brain that seems to grow and grow and grow. So a lot of clues there, and they seem to fit this picture.
Well, thank you. A reminder that we're speaking with Tony Wright. Him and Graham Ginn are the authors of Return to the Brain of Eden, Restoring the Connection Between Neurochemistry and Consciousness. It's really fascinating. It really is fascinating to read about. You're a scientist by nature?
Not in any sort of official sort of way. I mean, I've done some studying, but my academic background would be considered fairly limited. As I say, it's more to do with plants, and I got interested in the sort of biochemical angle. I did a thesis on genetic engineering a long time before it was a major public issue. So I got, had some academic tools, but the rest of it I just had to learn along the way. And really, this is very much a contextual thing.
Yeah.
In fact, interestingly, again, going back to the left-right brain data, it's well accepted that the left brain, that dominant hemisphere, cannot do context. It doesn't know how to join more than a couple of bits of information together at any one time. It cannot see the whole picture. And ironically, like all its other traits, it's considered specialized adaptation. Of course, it might just be very degenerate, and it's pretty useless. So really, it's just rearranging what we already have in front of us into a new picture. And that doesn't take great specialist skills. Of course, you need to know a little bit about a lot of subjects, but not a huge amount.
But diet is chief, right?
I think it's certainly, again, going back to these terminologies, it's the design and construction and fuel. So yes, it's a massive part of it. Although I certainly don't want to give the impression that it's simply enough to change diet, at least at this stage.
Hello, Tony. Tony's calling us from England, so we may have got cut off there, so you may give us a call back. In the meantime, we are speaking with Tony Wright, talking about his book, Return to the Brain of Eden, and I'm sure we'll get him back on the line. Thank you. Tony Wright's book is Return to the Brain of Eden, Restoring the Connection Between Neurochemistry and Consciousness. It's put out by Inner Traditions, innertraditions.com, if you want to know more about this book. Colin Groves, Professor of Biological Anthropology at Australian National University and co-author of Bones, Stones, and Molecules, writes, Return to the Brain of Eden presents a totally new way of looking at the evolution of the human brain. It is fresh and unexpected. It will make an impact and must be taken seriously in discussions of human origins. We have Tony Wright back on the line again, and we really haven't ascertained exactly how the disconnection happened, but we're very happy to have him back. Tony is our guest in this hour. And Tony, hi.
Hi, Gary.
Yeah, and we're speaking about a diet and how we've got to first ascertain the problem and take a look at what it is that we're dealing with, and which once we begin to understand what it is that the degeneration of our brain is taking place, then perhaps we can work on making changes to it. And one of the changes that is in the book about how our ancestors were, and how they had healthy brains, and but with the kind of foods that we're eating today, it's it makes it very clear that obviously this is going to have an effect on our DNA, our systems, our cells, our brains, everything.
Sure. Yeah. Well, we laughingly at the worst extreme call it junk, and to put it in a nutshell, we're building, we're designing, and I say design in terms of transcription, DNA reading, and so on. So we're designing, constructing, and fueling the most complex, chemically sensitive thing we know, and we use it for everything. It's our primary piece of equipment. We're building it from rubbish. It's absurd. If going back to the engineering analogies I was using earlier, if you treated your car like that, or your personal computer, people would laugh at you. They'd say you're crazy. And yet the thing between our ears is vastly more complex, and we don't give it a second thought. We just build it from rubbish, fuel it from rubbish, and wonder why we're in a mess. But yeah, diet. I'm trying to change the perception of diet. I kind of use the idea of advanced molecular engineering. That's what diet really is. Sort of putting that central stage and saying, yes, we need to do a rebuild, but we need to look at the hormonal elements. But because of the current situation we find ourselves in, we have one hemisphere that, from my perspective, is effectively reverted to primitive type more quickly. It's quite primitive now. It just doesn't have the capacity to do the things that we'd like to think it can. It's in poor shape. It's nobody's fault, but it's in real poor shape. However, the right hemisphere, this is due to sort of genetic asymmetry between the hemispheres. That basically our whole brain's in poor shape, but one side has regressed much more quickly, and of course that's the side in charge. So really it's a combination. It's trying to improve the build quality and the neurochemical fields and so on, but simultaneously it's a case of trying to inhibit the influence of the hemisphere that isn't working very well and cannot work very well, at the same time as stimulate the hemisphere that has at least relics of this ancient architecture, that has the capacities we'd like to think we could all have, these very advanced traits. And I think, going back to these ancient traditions, if you strip away the dogma and belief and so on surrounding them, I think really that's what they were trying to do. A lot of these traditions do allude to some form of natural diet and fasting and so on. And then a lot of the techniques, I think all the techniques fall generally into these two other camps, either approaches to inhibit the influence of the left hemisphere, the kind of Trappist tradition, not speaking, quieting the chattering voice. Again, interesting that the left hemisphere, yes, it's speech dominant, and yet the right hemisphere can sing, far more advanced, far more information, and yet the left hemisphere thinks that speech is more advanced, and that's kind of what we've grown up with. We have it back to front. So approaches or treatments, I would say, to inhibit the left hemisphere, and then simultaneously beginning to engage with treatments that can stimulate the right hemisphere. And it needs these high-spec fuels and high-spec build quality, so you need what we call diet. We need really good build quality. But on top of that, because it's kind of dormant, it's not really it's not remotely fully functional, we need to stimulate it. So that's where I think some of the shamanic traditions come in. Certainly things like complex music and dance and so on can help, but also some of these traditional plant medicines that seem to differentially stimulate the dormant hemisphere to the point where it can become conscious. I mean, for the most part, it's not conscious. It's our left hemisphere that's conscious. And the most amazing piece of kit, metaphorically, is in the basement and doesn't even know what it is anymore. So you kind of start putting these parameters back in place, And in modern times, it's become so fragmented. You get people obsessed with the idea, well, meditation's enough, or diet's enough, or psychedelics are enough. It's like, no, step right back, and you need a combination of these things judiciously applied in safe and gentle steps, but nevertheless working up to the idea that you rebuild the most complex thing we know, and then you begin to, as I say, limit the influence of the side of the brain that is in serious trouble. And again, this isn't about anybody's fault, it's just damaged. And at the same time begin to engage the hemisphere that can at least give us glimpses of who and what we really are. And when you put these things together in combination, it sounds quite formulaic, and it is, then pretty much guaranteed you get a radically different sense of self, at least glimpses of it. Sustainability is more problematic, but certainly being able to access the kind of states that are often alluded to in all sorts of mysterious language, not so difficult. Of course, I think my real interest there is if we have all sorts of latent abilities, but particularly latent cognitive function, much greater intelligence, then it would make sense to me, if there's any evidence at all that we have latent intelligence, before we try and solve these problems or even know which questions to ask, it would make sense to try and access some of this latent ability, then start trying to solve the problems. And I think that's eminently doable pretty much right now.
Well, thank you. Looking through your book, there's a lot we can learn. You mentioned about a study about our when people say, I had a gut reaction or a hunch that came from the gut. You're saying that there's a person, Michael Gershon, did some research, and he said, he demonstrated that serotonin was extremely active in the gut, and in fact, it is now known that the gut uses 95% of the body's serotonin. What is serotonin to our nervous system? What does it do?
Well, it's kind of part of the operating system, if you like. That's one way of looking at it. That's how I generally view the sort of neurochemistry or the sort of neuroactive biochemistry. It's sort of the particular cocktail elicits a particular response, but of course that response is limited by the neural structure itself. So it's or another way of looking at it might be the instruments in an orchestra. And if our origins were incredibly complex, if we were flooding our systems 24/7 with more plant chemistry than we even know about so far, again locked into this symbiotic relationship in the tropical forests, that's one way to view it. So this flux of incredibly complex biochemistry, and we've named a lot of these things, particularly the ones we produce internally. So our way of looking at ourselves, humans, at the moment is as if we're separate species. So we have serotonin, we have dopamine, we have these hormones like testosterone and estrogen. Well, that's great, and it's great to look at those things in isolation if as a species that's how we evolved. But if our origins are symbiotic, then you have to throw that book away and start looking at a much, much broader picture. And the idea that our neural system, particularly the advanced part, the upper part, the forward parts, evolved as part of this symbiotic union, then the essential neurochemistry isn't what our genome can produce, isn't what our DNA can produce. That's a very primitive kind of part of the equation. It's essential, it is part of it, but we also need this huge flood of plant chemistry, compounds. One group of compounds I've focused on is flavonoids. They tend to give fruit the color, and there's many different kinds of flavonoids, and they have all sorts of properties. They're highly protective, very antioxidant, great if you're trying to build a big brain out of very delicate tissue. They're also neuroactive, or a lot of them are neuroactive, so they stimulate brain function. Then a whole other raft of them affect hormones and change the way DNA is read. So really, this plugging into this plant biochemistry was a perfect formula to radically change our physiology and provide almost perfect conditions to grow a massive brain and fuel it on very high-octane fuel. And serotonin would be one of the chemicals that we're all very familiar with, but it's just one out of what must have been a much, much bigger ocean of chemicals that was flooding through our system all the time. And looking at the data, I think conservatively we've lost 95%, minimum 95% of this cocktail of chemicals, and that's in people who eat reasonably healthy today. So there's no wonder our neural system can't work. These chemicals were essential. And you mentioned the gut and Michael Gershen's work and so on. Again, that's coming slowly into more public awareness now, but he pretty much single-handedly discovered that a gut isn't just some tube you chuck some rubbish in and you get some sort of fuel out of it. It's actually a highly advanced neural tube. It's like neural tissue. It's just like a third brain almost. And the way we talk about it, the way I talk about it, the brain, the gut, this, that, and the other, well, really, they're not separate entities. They're part of a singular organism. So at one time, our gut was flooded with the same biochemistry that I'm talking about. That was its first interface. And, of course, it's all neuroactive stuff. So it's like our gut doesn't work properly anymore, and it's not connected properly to our neural system anymore. The kind of main conduit, the vagus nerve, pretty inactive now. And again, there's these ancient traditions talking about the chi and trying to develop chi energy, this energy from the gut. And you mentioned gut feelings. Well, it's part of an advanced neural system, but it's kind of in disarray now. And again, when you think what we chuck in our gut, it's not surprising. We've kind of been handed the most advanced and complex system that we barely understand. And we treat it like a supermarket trolley. We trash it around the place. We fill it full of junk. When really, it's more like a spaceship.
That's very interesting. Your book, "Return to the Brain of Eden: Restoring the Connection Between Neurochemistry and Consciousness." Now, "Return to the Brain of Eden." Now, when people think of Eden, they think of the fall of Adam and Eve. Eden being the paradise where they left. This can be likened to when you write the last of our direct ancestors moved or were forced out of the forest some 200,000 years ago. This eviction from the Garden of Eden necessitated a change of diet, which initiated an increase in steroid activity, which would have caused a corresponding decrease in the production of melatonin and phenylalanine. You mentioned these two factors would have profoundly affected many areas of the body's biochemistry, particularly the reproductive mechanism. So you can see our fall started there, right?
Well, sure. It's a holistic picture, and I was particularly interested in human behavior, human psychology. I was kind of waking up to the idea that we've created hell on earth here, and it takes a lot of energy to create the madness that we've sort of where we've turned in this incredibly rare, this kind of Goldilocks planet where we're entirely dependent on. We're trashing the hell out of it. Our best technologies usually military. It's designed to kill other humans. So I was particularly interested in what on earth is driving this. What is the structure driving the psychology and the behavior? And when it became apparent that hormones looked like a likely player in this, I thought, well, okay, if our origins were in a very different hormonal environment, and we've lost that, there must be clues in other areas of our physiology, particularly the hormonally sensitive ones. So I thought, well, okay, let's apply this hypothetical scenario to our reproductive capacity or our immune system, the thymus gland, and lo and behold, again, it seemed to make sense that if you were to factor these things in and kind of extrapolate and reverse engineer and so on, you end up with this sort of theoretical idea that we were in this symbiotic relationship with fruit. It was kind of in a simplistic way having an increasingly contraceptive effect. It was dampening down this archaic estrous cycle and these sex hormones, again, the steroids, estrogens, testosterone. And what I suspect happened, of course it's speculative at the moment, is that we got into a position where it was becoming more difficult to reproduce, and it needed a very powerful mechanism to procreate. And when I kind of looked at the basic mechanisms, bearing in mind that males and females start off effectively female, that's why males have nipples, and then it's purely the hormones, that kick in and change our physiology, and we become male and female. In this archaic sort of realm, there would have been less differentiation between us. Males and females would have been less different, particularly our psychology and our brain and so on. But looking at the parallels, it's pretty obvious that male ejaculation is effectively male ovulation. It's the same basic mechanism. And I got to think, well, okay, if you've got this blanket contraceptive effect going on, it could become a real lethal problem. We'd die out if we didn't respond to that. So I kind of looked at the idea of, well, maybe female orgasm was the equivalent of male ejaculation, female ovulation, and were these two things linked? And there's anecdotal evidence, and the mechanism seems to work in principle. So the idea was that actually it took an awful lot of sexual stimulation to achieve female ovulation. And of course, when we've lost all this hormonal effect, the whole system's gone into kind of runaway, more primitive form. This kind of estrous cycle re-emerged in a kind of degenerate form, and you have kind of what's considered normal menstruation, monthly ovulation, with or without sexual intercourse. So it kind of, the idea was to try and fit this theory to all these different elements. And again, so I think I mentioned the thymus gland. It's the hub of our center of our immune system, and it's known to be very sensitive to steroids. Again, testosterone, estrogens. It tends to shrink at puberty when our own steroids kick in. But of course, speculating again that wouldn't have happened in the forest, we would have had this protection from the forest chemistry, then these ancient myths of humans being phenomenally healthy, living a long time, it suddenly starts to make a lot more sense. Maybe it wasn't mythology in the way we tend to interpret it. Maybe it was an accurate natural history and an accurate diagnosis of what was going on. So for sure, I think the whole reproductive and immune element would have to fit this model, this theory, if it's going to make sense. And so far, although it's radically different to what we currently understand, the basic mechanisms seem to make sense. We know we evolved in the forest. We know we ate fruit. We now know that fruit's full of all these compounds. It must have had all these effects. We don't do that anymore. Therefore, things are going to be in disarray.
And thank you. Yes, that's true. You also write further on in your book, Under Consciousness and the Mechanisms of the Mind. Fortunately, not all is lost, although it now seems clear that the left hemisphere on its own has limited abilities. We have seen from Sperry's work, a researcher, that we do have a second sphere of conscious awareness, and we may not be able to access complete right hemispheric function at will, nor due to interference from the left, but it remains latently available, residing in a sort of dream world, unplugged yet present. I like that.
Yes, it's, I don't want to be the guy coming along and saying, hey ho, I've got this great diagnosis of why we're in a complete mess and that's it. As you said earlier, the whole point of this is if we're in serious trouble, and by that I don't mean our behavior, that's a given. I'm talking about our neurology and the psychology associated with it. The first port of call has got to be recognizing that. It's got to be an accurate diagnosis. If we don't know what's wrong, we forget it. We're lost. So that's really my first sort of objective, is to draw attention to the idea that maybe there's a serious problem here. But of course, beyond that, and the reason I've persisted with this all the while is, I think there is a lot of hope here. I think we have half of our system is still in much better shape anyway, much more function, a lot of latent ability. And once we recognize that, I really don't think the practicalities of accessing that are the problem. We already know a lot about how to do that. It's making the compelling case in the first place. It's making the case that, look, we're in serious trouble, but there is a solution. We've got to start wanting the solution, not wanting more of the same. Of course, the paradox is our left hemisphere, our left sense of self, hates change. It's terrified of change. It would almost die rather than do anything different. And we've almost prohibited and legislated against the very things that can give us more access. But if it's possible to explain in left brain language, in engineering terminology and neurological terminology, look, this is where the problem is, and this is what we need to change, then I think there's hope. And for sure, again, going back to these traditions, there's a lot of information. It's not difficult to dampen down the effects of your left hemisphere, engage your right hemisphere, and it's certainly not difficult to improve the build quality in neurochemistry. We're all responsible for that. Every day we choose what we build ourselves from, what we fuel up and build our brain from. That's a choice we make, and we can choose to continue building it from complete garbage, or we can start choosing, incremental steps to improve its construction, its neurochemistry, and begin implementing treatments to access a much better state of self, where the fear starts to go away, where things start to feel a lot better, or intelligence improves. I mean, who wouldn't want that? Who's going to say, no, I want a damaged brain, I want more of the same?
Exactly. And you mentioned about meditation and ways in which we can work with our brains consciously.
Sure. Well, I think pretty much all these ancient approaches had some validity. I think some were more powerful approaches. Some probably worked better a long time ago when we weren't in such poor shape. But again, it's back to this holistic approach. I think any individual approach is very limited. This is a complex. We're a complex organism, and it's simply not enough to meditate or just to take psychedelics or just to change your diet, because these are different components of the same problem, and you're just going to reach a limiting factor. You need to address them all, careful, incremental steps, but you need to address them all. And for sure, meditation is a good place to start. And some people are more sensitive than others. This condition has, or it seems to me, it has a spectrum of symptoms. Some people have it more severely than others. So, of course, some people, we can consider them very sensitive. They can meditate and get quite into deep altered states, but that's certainly not the case for everyone. And of course, people use various approaches, and if they get a glimpse or can access something, they tend to look back at where they were and go, oh my God, I found a solution. Well, we should be looking in the opposite direction, as that, well, how much better can this get? Because the ancient traditions, they don't talk about a few people having a bit of a problem. It seems to be a universal thing, and it was severe, and it got worse and worse and worse. So I think we should be looking for vast improvements that are possible, and I think that's certainly the case. I think we have a phenomenal piece of equipment still, if we can wake it up and get it working. And once we do that, I think then that will bring us further insights and solutions to how to really fix this.
Well, your book certainly helps us to see what the situation that we're dealing with is. Tony Wright is our guest, and a book that he co-authored with Graham Ginn, Return to the Brain of Eden, Restoring the Connection Between Neurochemistry and Consciousness, really helps us to not only see what the problem is, but helps us to push us in a direction in which we can like all is not lost, and that we can start now. Once the awareness is here, we can make the changes necessary. But I think your book is is certainly helpful in seeing that we have to make the changes if we're going to, look at what a life is, see what we're dealing with, and see what you can do personally, and hopefully this will catch on. We certainly hope so. Tony, you have a website?
Yes, I've got a couple of websites. The main one is the sort of the self-published title, going back a bit. It's called Left in the Dark, obviously a pretty poor pun in many ways, but leftinthedark.org.uk. There's quite a bit of introductory material on there.
.org?
Yeah, leftinthedark.org.uk.
.uk, okay.
And then there's a kind of sister site. They both need a lot of renovation, unfortunately. But there's quite a lot of information and links on there. The second site is Beyond _Belief. So Beyond _Belief.
Is Beyond with a U?
Beyond with a what, sorry?
Is Beyond with a U or not? Beyond, how do you spell Beyond?
Oh, sorry, BEYOND. Beyond. Beyond-belief.org.uk.
Beyond-belief.org.uk. Okay, got it. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a link on Left in the Dark to it anyway. So there's quite a lot of information on there, and then there's links to a YouTube channel where I've done various talks and interviews and so on. And I mean, really, Gary, I'm the last thing I'm going to say is I've got all the answers here, because by definition I have a left hemisphere, and it's a very problematic piece of kit. I'm really, what I'm hoping to do is inspire people to ask similar kinds of questions, not presume that we're advanced, not presume that we're heading towards some kind of wonderful civilized sort of society, but we're in deep trouble here, exactly as our ancestors said, and just start asking questions and start looking at things differently. And obviously, I've spent 20 years looking at this, so I'm suggesting there are some good places to start looking. There may be other places, there may be things I've missed, obviously. But, I think looking at the mess we're in, it's imperative we clearly doing the same thing isn't going to work. I think it was Einstein that said something along the lines of, doing the same thing and expecting a different result is a symptom of insanity. Well, we need to do something different. And clearly changing our behavior is very, very difficult. That's pretty obvious. But it's pretty apparent from all the evidence that if you change the structure of your consciousness equipment, your neural system, or whatever you want to call it, you get a change in behavior every time or your money back. So the question is it possible to change it in a positive way? And when you look at, our evolutionary origins, well, it's pretty clear we've lost all this complexity. We've lost all these neurochemical compounds. We can start reversing those things and start getting into a state of mind where we can at least begin to see a little bit better, and hopefully in a bootstrapping effect, the more we push down that road, the more clear it becomes. Otherwise, I think we're going off a cliff into some kind of oblivion.
I agree, and thank you for helping to wake us up with your book, Return to the Brain of Eden, Restoring the Connection Between Neurochemistry and Consciousness. Tony Wright and Graham Ginn. It's on Inner Traditions, books on inner traditions, and leftinthedark.org.uk. Tony, got to go now, but I extend my gratitude for you being on the program today.
Well, thanks very much, and really enjoyed it, and I hope your listeners find it of interest.
Well, thank you. Well, if you'd like to stay on the line, I'll speak with you off air for a moment.